Hi everyone, welcome to week 5, where we're going to be diving into Spinoza's Ethics. And before I focus on some of the nitty-gritty details, I want to do a few sort of like housekeeping reminders. Y'all have been doing a really good job on the discussion forum. It makes me really happy, and I really, appreciate that y'all are taking it very seriously and using the opportunity to engage with one another. It means a lot, and I'm sure that that's going to be reflected in the kind of work that you end up doing for later assignments, the midterm and the final. Now that leads me to talking about the midterm. The midterm is going to be coming up in a few weeks. I believe it's due at the end of week 8, although you might want to double check the syllabus to confirm that. And essentially, the way that the syllabus describes the midterm is that what I'm looking for is for you to read a peer-reviewed academic article, by default, one of the ones that I've given you about our course material, but if you'd like to propose another one you'd like to write a review of, you're welcome to do that. And you just write a short review of the article. You're like, okay, here is sort of like what the contributions of this piece are. Here are the parts that I agree with. Here are the parts that I disagree with, and so on. And really, a lot of the time, whenever you're writing for these sort of assignments, my suggestion is to imagine that you're writing for an interested classmate, right? And so what this means is that you don't necessarily need to say things like, you know, oh, Descartes was a philosopher, right? That's like kind of like too intro, right? You have to assume, okay, they know like, okay, the stuff is on the syllabus, but maybe they don't know like the content of what it has to say, right? And so if you think about it that way, then you might think about it as like, okay, well, my classmates, they probably know that like we're going to be reading Spinoza, for example, but I want to explain to them exactly how the substance mode relation works, or something like that, right? Hopefully that helps, so that your audience isn't just like me, right? It's like also, you want to sort of imagine that your audience are your peers, right? Other students. And that your demonstration, the mastery of the material is like really your ability to teach it, at least potentially, to another student. And so really, in terms of the midterm, that's a lot of what I'm looking for is like, as we mentioned sort of in the opening video, a lot of the way that I've structured this course is to try to prepare you as much as possible for what the expectations are in sort of like upper level or graduate level humanities coursework, right? And sort of like at each stage, you're always sort of writing for your peers, and the midterm is sort of like in those sort of spaces, upper level humanities, grad level coursework, a lot of the time you'll be expected to do your own research, right? To find academic articles about whatever topic, in our case, early modern philosophy, right? And you'll be expected to, be able to sort of sift through this kind of stuff and see like, okay, like here's the stuff that's worth reading, here's the stuff that's not worth reading, right? And then be able to critically engage with it, right? And so the midterm is really your ability to do that, but where I'm helping you out a little bit more, right? I'm showing you like, okay, I've done the research for you. Here are some articles, right, that are pretty good about the topics that we're going to discuss. So you don't need to do your own research, right? And then as far as like what research papers will look like in upper level courses for y'all eventually is you'll be expected to, produce your own research and engage with the existing literature. And in this assignment, you don't need to do that so much. You just need to sort of like write a review of, um, you know, whichever text you end up choosing. And, just so that you all know, and I mentioned this in the syllabus, but it's worth mentioning again, if you go to, I think it's ndpr.edu, that is the Notre Dame Philosophical Review. And they post reviews of like all sorts of different books, like, if you're more interested in ethics, they have that. If you're more interested in Heidegger, they have that. If you're more interested in Japanese philosophy, they have some of that, right? And it can be a good place to see like, okay, like what is this sort of like genre of writing? Like what is it to sort of like write a review? Because in those, there's kind of a standard formula. It's like, oh, this is what the book is about. It has these chapters. I really liked this, or I had these sort of reservations, and overall I liked it or I didn't like it, right? Um, that's sort of what I'm expecting from y'all, but obviously it's a little easier because instead of reviewing a whole book, you're just reviewing an article, right? And then similarly, you have read the material that the articles are talking about, right? They're going to be about like Descartes or Princess Elizabeth or Spinoza or Leibniz, who's going to be a philosopher that we end up discussing next. So yeah, that's basically what you can expect from the midterm. I'm telling you about it now because it's actually the sort of assignment where it's easy to get ahead, right? Like if you know that of the things that we're going to read in the first half of class, that the most interesting to you is Descartes or Spinoza or something like that, then it's like, okay, well, now you can sort of get started on reading those articles really early, right? Yeah. And then just sort of relatedly, I wanted to talk about like just the fact that what we're going to be reading for the next few weeks is like really difficult material, right? And so I want to properly like let you know like what the expectations are. Like I do not expect mastery, right? In other classes there is sort of like the expectation that you just provide the correct answer, right? Like if you're in an anatomy class, then there just is an answer for, whatever muscle or ligament or whatever you're examining is, and your job is to remember it and to write it down, right? And if you take this approach to reading the Ethics by Spinoza, it will prove to be extremely, extremely difficult, right? Like, this is just very difficult philosophy. It's existed for hundreds of years, the expectation is not that you have a breakthrough and like you're the one who like finally understands Spinoza 100%, right? Like people dedicate their whole lives to reading and rereading these books, right? And for most of you, this is going to be the first time that you engage with it, right? And so I do not have the expectation that you end up getting everything right, and I do not have the expectation that you will retain everything, right? To be perfectly honest, like for a lot of people, early modern philosophy is like not their thing. It's sort of like a memory that they have of undergrad or grad school or something. It's like, oh yeah, they forced us to read Spinoza and Leibniz, and I hated it, and I got through it in the end, right? That's the attitude a lot of people have towards this sort of material, right? And so I don't come in with the expectation that like you're gonna love everything, right? It is challenging. It is very difficult, right? It is very time consuming, and it is very abstract, right? And so that is just the challenge that we collectively as a class just have to address and deal with over the next 4 or so weeks. In my opinion, this material that we're covering, the Spinoza and the Leibniz, is like the most difficult material that we're going to be discussing in the class. So what that means is just that, we have to be ready to try really hard to understand what we can from the text and to just sort of like really honestly say like, okay, here are the things I understand and here are the things I don't understand. Right. And that's one of the most productive things that you can do in your discussion board, because if you're confused about something, it's probably true that someone else is too, you know? Okay, so I just wanted to say that so that we could set the expectations for one another that, like, yes, the course is sort of like structured around challenging you, right? It's structured around challenging you both in terms of the content that we're reading. We're reading a lot of Spinoza, we're reading a lot of Leibniz, and this is just difficult material. But I'm also challenging you in the sense of I'm trying to prepare you as best as I can for upper level humanities, social science sort of coursework, right? And that means that, you're going to be trying new things or, you know, just sort of like producing work, right? And that's a hard thing to do, and I want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge just like um, how well y'all have done up to this point, and just say that I believe that y'all can get through this next material that's going to be really hard too. But we need to be upfront about it, right? It is really hard. And if you come in knowing that, then you can set your expectations accordingly, and we can slog through a lot of this stuff together. And hopefully, my ideal hope is that even though other people think that this material is like very difficult and very abstract and, disconnected from their interests, I hope that I can help make the material seem more alive, right? Seem more important. Seem like it's not just like a slog that every Western philosophy student just like has to go through. Really, the aim is like if we know this material really well, then what we gain from that is sort of like resources and a knowledge bank that will help in later courses, right? Like, maybe you're not specifically interested in Spinoza or something like that, but maybe you're interested in phenomenology, for example, which is a philosophical tradition that's sort of upper level and sort of, associated with your own experiences, right? Well, Husserl quote wrote quite a lot about Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, and then similarly with later figures like Sartre, or even Heidegger ends up writing a lot about Leibniz, right? So, really the most important thing that we're doing is just sort of like getting a resource bank, being able to understand what someone means whenever they criticize Descartes' dualism or something like that, right? And having like a very sort of like specific thing in mind for what people are referring to in those sort of cases. Okay, so I think that that's enough for now in terms of housekeeping stuff. I think that y'all are very well prepared to tackle this material and that we can do it together. And so the way that we're going to do this over the next couple of weeks is next week. I'm going to post a conversation that I had with Kevin Lauer, who's like one of my best friends, and he's somebody that helped get me into early modern philosophy and helped make me fall in love with it. And so my hope is that by having him come and talk with us, that he has that effect on some of y'all too. And so there, we're going to do a lot of like close readings of specific propositions. We're going to be looking at book 2. We're going to go kind of in order. We're going to, give more detailed analysis. Whereas today, I wanted to do a shorter video, or at least not a long video, and sort of give more of like a general overview for like what it does Spinoza's metaphysics look like and why does it look like that, right? Okay, so in terms of the board, we're going to go left side, right side. Some of this God stuff we're going to do at the same time. But okay, some of the most important terminology to know and understand for reading Spinoza is what is sometimes called the building blocks of Spinoza's metaphysics. And so this is like, hey, if the world is made up of stuff, right? These are the different categories of that stuff, right? And you might remember this. This might be somewhat familiar from when we were discussing the late Descartes material, especially like that analysis in the Principles of Philosophy, right? Descartes said, in Descartes' scheme, right, you had the absolute substance, which was God, right? And then you had all of those finite substances that seem like they have a relative form of independence, right? But not a true form of independence in the way that the absolute substance or God did, right? And so Descartes admits, like, hey, I'm basically equivocating whenever I use the word substance. I'm using it in two distinct senses, right? But I'm acting like they're the same. Where those senses are, substance is absolute substance as completely unconditioned, right? And then substance as finite substance, as conditioned by God, but maybe not other finite substances. And so Spinoza revises Descartes' metaphysics by saying, like, okay, but what if we were to create sort of a metaphysics where we didn't equivocate on this point, right? Where we use substance only to refer to the singular, absolute substance that is God, right? Okay. So, and then what this means is then there is one substance that has two attributes. We're going to qualify that in just a minute, but for now we'll say two. And here I'll write this next to it. Number one says substance, number two says attribute, number three says mode. And then there are little arrows that are indicating a dependent sort of relationship. And so how many substances are there? One, right? Excuse me. Spinoza has a very long argument for why there can only be one substance, and in the beginning of the ethics, right? And we're not going to trace his specific argumentative pattern as much as give us the tools for understanding the argument that he makes, right? Okay, so how many substances are there? There's one, right? There's one substance that everything else just sort of participates in, right? Is a modification of, and Spinoza is going to call that God, right? God is the absolute substance that everything else depends on. Okay, and so attribute. What are attributes for Spinoza? Attributes are essential properties, right? So this is like basically what Descartes meant by the essence of finite substances, right? Descartes said that the essence of a body is to be extended, right? And the essence of the mind is the sort of reflective, contemplative activity, judging, thinking, right? Whereas Descartes referred to those as substances because they had a relative kind of independence. What Spinoza is going to call those as attributes, right? Those are like two different ways that substance shows up, right? It shows up on the one hand in minded things and in the relationship between minded things. And in another, it shows up as sort of like the whole system of bodies, right? The whole world, the whole universe, right? And this explains why, to jump down a little bit here to the blue here, I wrote Deus sive natura. And so what that means is God or nature, right? That these two words are interchangeable with one another. Right? And this is ultimately where Spinoza gets accused of atheism, right? Because for him, God is not like bearded man in the sky, different from the world or the universe or something like that, and then like bearded man in the sky like decides on features about the universe, right? Spinoza says, no, Okay, if rationalism is good for anything at all, what it should be good for is getting rid of superstition, right? And one of the chief superstitions that Spinoza tries to combat is namely sort of like wishful thinking, right? And we imagine God to be, bearded white man in the sky, or at least that's often how God is depicted, right? Because, like, we imagine, from our own position of weakness as a finite thing, right, that the universe is sort of reflective of our interests or desires, right? That the world was like set up to be there for us, right? And this is sort of the essence behind a lot of sort of Christian terminology, especially, right? Is that, God created man in his image, right? These sort of metaphors, right? But for Spinoza, strictly speaking, right, what we're doing whenever we have this sort of traditional religious conception of God is that we are not conceiving of God, namely in God's very nature, which is as a substance, right? Instead, we're bringing in all of these human qualities to God, right? We imagine that God makes decisions. We imagine that God, determines right or wrong. We imagine just sort of like that God is like us, but, without any of our impurities, right? But for Spinoza, part of what sort of the advent of modernity has shown us is basically that this image of the universe is full of superstition, right? That actually, what the discovery of heliocentrism showed was that human beings are not at the center of the universe. And in fact, that understanding the universe requires decentering the human perspective, right? We have to understand that the perspective that we have, where it appears that the earth that the sun revolves around the earth and so on, that has to be sort of reevaluated from seeing things from a total or universal sort of perspective, like the perspective where you can model the solar system not from the Earth's point of view, right, but from a relatively indifferent point of view, right? And so in the same way that modernity required, astronomy, right, required us to abandon all of these sort of religious presuppositions about the nature of God and our place in the universe, right? So too, Spinoza thinks that getting the philosophy right requires that we abandon a lot more of the religious superstition, right, than what Descartes was comfortable claiming, right? Descartes' sort of strategy was, okay, I do have this sort of like modern philosophy, right, where I'm starting over from the beginning and I'm making it consistent with physics and I'm arguing against all of this sort of like scholastic stuff that was basically like medieval Aristotelian philosophy, right? And he says, but like I'm going to sort of like demonstrate the veracity of some traditional Christian beliefs, right? Like in the identity of the soul, right? In the afterlife, right? Descartes' cogito argument sort of proves that there is such thing as like a purely minded or purely incorporeal entity, right? That contains our personality and that persists through the death of our body, right? And so in these cases, Descartes wanted to show like, hey, philosophy is ultimately not that hostile to the findings of religion. It just requires us to sort of like revise how we've come about justifying those beliefs and probably abandon some of them, right? And so he takes up this sort of like moderate approach to the existing religious tradition, whereas Spinoza required so much be abandoned or overturned, right? For Spinoza, his conception of God, and I've written this in the bottom corner here, in red, God is not a person, right? We imagine God to be a person because we want to attribute some of our finite qualities to God, right? But fundamentally for Spinoza, God is not a person, right? And then relatedly, God has no will, right? Spinoza doesn't think that even sort of like the model where that Descartes has about judgment, where it's like, oh, there's two possibilities, I'm indifferent between the two of them, and so I'll just pick one, right? That's sort of like Descartes' vision of judgment and freedom, and that sort of like creeps into his image of God too, right? That God can sort of like just decide on mathematical or physical laws or something like that, right? For Spinoza, no. Okay, that all has to go, right? It all has to go because for Spinoza, when we think that we're free in that way, in sort of the free will sense, what we really are is we're deceived about the things that are causing us, right? And so whereas I think that there's no reason, or the reason entirely stems with me for why I ultimately make one decision rather than another, Spinoza's going to say, no. What happens in those circumstances is you're just determined by your environment and you don't realize it, right? And so God, like human beings, ultimately has no free will in that sense, right? And then relatedly, God, for Spinoza, does not make decisions, right? God, everything about God follows completely from God's essence, including God's existence, right? And so while for us, for you and for me, when we make decisions, like we take into account like a bunch of things that Spinoza would call modes, right? It's like, oh, I was going to go to class today, but my tires got slashed somehow, and now I can't go, right? And so the factors that influence my decision are these, finite temporal things that happen in time, right? But God, as substance, could never be caused by a modification, right? God is the underlying basis for that reality, right? And so God doesn't make decisions, right? And all of these sort of go together. And then fourth and finally, then what that means is that everything that happens in the universe flows from the essence of God, right? And so what that means is that the universe is not teleologically ordered. It's not ordered to produce the best possible circumstances for creatures like us, right? And in fact, it often is not the best for creatures like us. You could say coronavirus, right? As sort of an example of that, right? It's like if the world were set up in a way by a benevolent God, then like why would there be coronavirus? Why would there be natural disasters and so on, right? So you can imagine these beliefs about God piss off a lot of religious people, both Spinoza's own Jewish community, but as well as sort of like Christian tradition. For like hundreds of years, it was like reading Spinoza was very taboo, right? He was considered an atheist, and reading him was considered like heretical, right? And so, yeah, that's just part of Spinoza's legacy. But okay, so to return to the scheme that we were talking about originally, the building blocks, we got sidetracked talking about substance because we didn't want to know more about Spinoza's conception of God, right? God is the underlying substance of which everything else is only a manifestation, right? And then we talked about attributes, which are essential properties, right? And I wrote here 2/infinite. And what I mean by that is that we as human beings only know two attributes of God. We know thought and extension, right? But Spinoza says that from God, an infinite number of things take place, right? And so presumably there's an infinite number of attributes, and we only, as finite human beings, have access to two of them, right? Okay, And then third and finally, there are modes, which you might think of as inessential properties, right? So like with a book, right? In the case of a book, that book has certain properties that are essential to it and certain properties that are inessential to it, right? The fact that it is, I don't know, 375 pages, right? That is an inessential property, right? Like I could tear out one of the pages, there could have been a printing error, right? All of those sorts of things, and it would still be a book, right? And so those features about the book can be modified. I can, paint over the cover. I can get it rebound, right? All those sorts of things, right? But what could never change about, and the fact that it's a book, right? That's contingent, right? It's like I could tear it in half if I were much, 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 much stronger, right? And then it would no longer serve its function as a book, right? But it would still have other properties, right? Like it would still be in space, right? All of that stuff, me ripping up the book or whatever, no matter what I do to it, paint it, burn it, whatever, there's going to be little particles of matter that take up space, right? And so that's why the attributes locate an essential quality and the mode is an inessential quality, right? Or inessential property. And so what that means is that all the particular things, pens, paper, whatever, non-academic example, volleyballs, right? Those are modes. Those are ways that the one substance of the world shows up at a particular point in time for a finite amount of time, right? Eventually, there's going to be some other mode that squishes it or causes it to exit existence, right? So the substance is the thing in which all of the properties sort of inhere, right? The attribute are the essential properties, and the modes are the inessential properties, right? And so we'll do this religious discussion down in this bottom left quadrant at the end. And for now, let's talk about what I've written up here in the top right corner. I wrote in blue natura naturans versus natura naturata. And this is a distinction that's really easy to miss because the essential part is just the suffix of the second word. Natura naturans versus natura naturata, right? And what this means outside of the Latin is basically the first one means nature naturing, and the second one is nature natured, right? And basically the way that you might think about this distinction is two different perspectives that you can have on any given object. You can think of it as sort of like from the point of view of substance, right? Or you can think about it from the point of view of a mode, right? So this part, I'll do this part, right? On the one hand, it's a mode, right? I can think about the specific qualities of it that adhere to it simply because it is a pen, right? I can give a history. It was made in this factory, right? It has, this ink. It had, all of this kind of stuff, right? And that would be to give a history of how it's a modification, right? To be a history about how, like, it takes on particular sort of qualities in time, right? And so you might think about this as being like a results-oriented approach, right? But there's another way to consider it, sort of like a philosophical consideration, that would consider it from the perspective of substance as a process, right? So God is sort of the cause of him, her, them, self, right? And sort of like continually produces particular modifications of itself as a result, right? And so, one way to think about it is that this pen is a property of God, right? That God, one feature about God is that God from, whatever period of time, in 2020 or 2022 or who knows, right? Ends up manifesting in particular as this sort of like raw materials that eventually becomes composed into a particular pen, right? And so to think about natura naturans is to think about God as sort of like a process, right? Of like continually producing new modifications in time, right? Whereas to think about natura naturata is to think about the particular things that sort of like God as an engine sort of like produces over time, right? And basically what this is pointing out is that God is the explanation for the essence of things, right? Whereas their existence, the fact that they, exist at a particular time, those are produced by other modes, right? And so at another point in the ethics, Spinoza refers to sort of like this first category as being an immanent kind of causality, right? We can think about like how particular pens or books or whatever are modifications of God, right? But then we can also think about how they emerge at a particular point in time, how they're caused by other modes, and so on, right? Okay, really briefly, bottom left quadrant, where we talked about Deus sive natura, God or nature. This has resulted in people thinking very different things about Spinoza, right? And so I've listed three sort of interpretations, prominent interpretations of Spinoza. One is atheism. Why do people think Spinoza is an atheist? Well, he seems to take God, which is this religious concept, right, and strip it of all of its religious or mythological significance, right? And this is really highlighted by Deus sive natura, right? God doesn't have any individual personal connection to you in Spinoza's picture, right? God is ultimately indifferent to whether you live or die, right? And the way to know about God from Spinoza's point of view is not to read religious texts, it's to engage in science and philosophy. Why? Because science teaches you about how modes interact, and philosophy teaches you about essences, right? Or substance, right? You don't learn about those things via authority or in existing religious institutions or by consulting holy texts, right? And so for many people, they interpreted Spinoza as an atheist, right? Okay, what's another interpretation? Well, another interpretation is that Spinoza was a pantheist, right? And so what that means is that God is everything, right? All particular modifications of God, all modes, all particular objects just are God showing up in a particular form at a particular time, right? Excuse me. So on this view, God literally is everything, right? In many, I don't know, in sort of like the history of reception of Spinoza's philosophy, often to say that Spinoza is a pantheist is kind of also to accuse him of being an atheist, right? And the reason why is because pantheism is associated with sort of like paganism, sort of like pre-monotheistic religious traditions, right? At least that is how the predominantly Christian monotheistic narrative at the time understands pantheism, right? But importantly, there is a difference. Like pantheism says, hey, God does exist, right? And it seems like that's what Spinoza is saying as well, right? So, but, still, you might be convinced by some of the atheistic arguments. Finally, the third interpretation of Spinoza is called acosmism, right? You've probably never heard of this. So in this case, A is like atheist, right? Where it's a modification of what comes next, right? Saying it's not that, right? And so cosmism is the cosmos, right? And so in this case, Spinoza is interpreted as denying that there are any real particular things, that there are modes that really truly exist, right? In this case, like, this interpretation of Spinoza sort of hinges on interpreting modes as sort of like illusions or appearances, right? God appears in the form of a pen or book or whatever, but really pens and books or whatever don't really exist. Only God does, right? And so this is subtly different than saying that God exists in everything, because this says modes are real, and this says modes are fake or illusory in some capacity. So I'm going to stop it there just so that we stay at 40 minutes. I hope that you've enjoyed this week. Next week, once again, I hope that you stay tuned because we're going to have Kevin on and it's going to be a great time. I hope you have a great week. Bye.